Okay, let's start with a sketch. First, I place my horizon line, and I'm going to put it a little bit lower than on the photo, even though just marginally. Keep the headland roughly the same. What attracted me to this composition is the light and dark between the headland and the beach, and then that bit of light that comes onto the headland. So we have this alternating pattern of light and dark across the painting. Also, this is sped up to play twice as fast as I really sketched it. Changing the shape of that water run, it's an overflow from a lagoon that's breaking into the beach and then it's running into the ocean. This is a lovely compositional device that leads us into the painting towards the big headland, which is called Long Reef, and that's in the northern side of Sydney, one of my favorite beaches to go for a walk and take photos and then do paintings. I've sketched in some clouds that aren't in the photo, but I have certainly seen before. And I'm also going to add some of the people that you can see in the reference photo, but they're tiny. So I'm making it a bit bigger. And I'm using them as a device to connect the bottom half with the upper half of the painting by placing them really just right at the intersection between where the beach ends and the headland starts. And then I'm going to add a little dog in the front. That gives us a bit of a story to what might be happening there, even though I'm not a big fan of dogs on beaches, especially without leashes. But this is a painting, so everyone's safe, everything's fine. I'm going to start with some raw sienna, a very watery wash, to put into my white clouds. I rarely leave my clouds completely white. That's a bit too extreme. I like to tone them down and give them some warmth. And that will then beautifully contrast with the cool blue of the sky that I paint, and with the cloud shadows as well. That'll come in a minute. And the other reason why I like to put something into my white of my clouds is that I can now create soft edges where the sky touches the clouds. I'm careful not to touch all of the wet patches in my clouds. I want some harder edges and some softer edges. I always like to aim for variations of edges. So, have soft and hard edges. Same for colors. There is cerulean and cobalt in my sky, and I make things a bit darker on the right side and a bit lighter on the left side, and then a bit lighter when we come down to the horizon as well. So variation in the strength and the colors, variation in the edges. That's what makes a painting more interesting. Gonna use the same raw sienna, maybe with a touch of that blue that's in the sky, and then cover the headland right away as well. I mixed a bit of lavender for my cloud shadows, because lavender is a great color for that. It's already a little bit cooler but light, and strengthened the top corner there on the right a little bit just to get stronger contrast into the sky. And now I'm painting the cloud shadows in as well. And I'm trying to mix a neutral grey here, and that can be achieved by mixing your three primaries. Raw sienna in this instance, my blues, and a little bit of quinacridone rose. Softening the edges of my shadows. There is no hard edges in cloud shadows. Wiped my brush clean, and then I'm smudging my edges there. One of the challenges with clouds is that they shrink as you paint. Well, I shrink them. My sky will cover more than I had intended. That's why I always sketch them in, even very lightly, very loosely, but just to make sure that I leave enough white for the actual clouds, because they can easily disappear. And then I'm going to add a few more really, really small clouds at the horizon level to create depth in your skies. Clouds are bigger at the top and smaller towards the horizon. That creates aerial perspective that pulls us into the distance. And while I have various blue mixes on my palette, I'm also going to paint in the tidal inlet that's running across the beach. It's reflecting the blue of the sky. A few strokes of darker color while it's wet so it can blend in. Now it's time to cover the beach. Raw sienna again, but a bit more pigment in there, and also added a touch of burnt sienna to create a bit more saturation in my color. In the approach I'm taking for this painting, the aim of the first layer is to cover everything first with a base color, a really light wash, and then come in with a second layer to define the painting. Skies, I like to finish in my first wash. I very rarely go in and do anything else. In this instance, I'm going to darken the cloud shadows a little bit later on. They're a little bit too light. That's okay, but other than that, try and paint my skies as fast and loose as possible. I'm also painting around the top of the people. I want them to be white and then contrasting against a dark cliff. And I'm painting in the ocean, and that one I'm going to paint in the right value. That's quite dark actually. It's a solid mid value, and the paint is quite dry so that I can do a bit of dry brushing and create the idea of waves. And that was ultramarine with a touch of turquoise to create the ocean color. Now I'm going to mix my headland color, and that is a pretty strong color. The headland's going to be the darkest element on the page, so I want to make sure I get enough value in there. And I'm not quite sure whether it should be a dark brown or a dark purple or a dark blue, so a good idea is to have a spare piece of paper, ideally the same paper that you're painting on, not a different kind of paper, so you can judge the color and the value of what you're about to commit to. And you can see I'm going for a pretty solid purple there. It has a bit of warmth in it still, because it's the late afternoon. There's a lot of warm light. The sun is coming, but it's in shadow. So purple is a halfway point, between a warm and a cool color. If I was to focus on the foreground, then those headlands would be really, really light, so that they would recede into the background. But again, here it's a pretty strong focal point. The headland is kind of the purpose of the painting, and everything else is leading into the headland and giving it context. And I'm going to carefully paint around the top of my couple that's walking there in the distance. And you may have noticed I'm using pretty much one brush all the way through. It's a round sable brush, which is quite versatile. It's got a nice point to it, so I can do fairly detailed work as well as getting enough pigment on there for larger areas. There's the shaft of light, so part of that headland is sort of illuminated, but I'm going to have to fix that up because I didn't really get that right. It looks a bit like a layer cake at the moment. And now I'm adding a bit more burnt sienna into this headland in the front, because that is a different rock. It's quite red. When you go back to the reference photo, you'll see that it looks really red. And I like that. I like the difference in colors. Again, variation. But if I change color, then I don't change the value. So if you look at that in black and white, you will see that the purple and the brown color next to each other will pretty much produce the same gray, because they're very close in value. And now I've mixed a muddy green for the top of the cliff and dropping in some different greens in there as well. Again, variation, and letting that blend together. If you are taking inspiration from this video and you want to try your own cliff painting, don't follow my colors. You can use your own colors. It really doesn't matter. What I'm demonstrating here is a simple composition, have some leading lines going into the distance, have a clear focal point with the people walking towards those cliffs. So the foreground has now dried enough. I'm now giving definition to this sandbank. And because it's closer to us, colors are stronger, values are darker, adding more definition. The light's coming from the left side, so the right bank is lighter, gets the sunlight, and that's why we have the strong shadow on that left bank there. And then sometimes I just have stupid ideas, like putting in some color there and I don't like it, but it's watercolor. That's what I love about it. You just put some water on it and you diffuse it and then it's gone. And now I'm adding in the shadow of that ridge, and I've chosen a purple color for that. It's a bit different than the shadow itself of the edge. It's hard to see on the video. Cameras don't pick up everything, especially when it comes to the darker colors. The shadow is a bit different from the actual edge of the bank. And now I'm going to add in some darker sand. It's very shallow, so the water doesn't cover everything. I wanted to hint at that. And again, need to fix it up a bit, soften it out with a clean brush. And then tweak those edges a little bit as well, just to make it a bit less smooth. And then some detail in the foreground. And I'm going to strengthen some of those edges so that it reads properly as a little river eating its way into the beach. I'm covering that lighter part of my headland in the background. It isn't quite cohesive with the shadow part around it. It was meant to look like the sunlight hits that part of the cliff, and if and when I'm going to repaint this, which no doubt I will, because I've got hundreds of photos of this cliff, I'll try and do a better job of getting the light. I'm still happy with how the painting turns out, don't get me wrong. It's just different than what I expected, which again is something you have to just come to peace with, especially with watercolor, and follow the painting rather than holding fast on a vision or a reference photo and trying to match it exactly. You start somewhere and then just let yourself be guided by how the water and the pigment and your brush comes together on the page. A few touches here and there just to create a bit more realism into that cliff. And as mentioned before, I'm going to darken the clouds a little bit. I try and avoid going into the clouds or into the skies in my second layer. But if it has to be, then it can be done. And using that same technique of wetting the edges with a clean brush just to soften that out. And that gives those clouds just a little bit more weight. Time for the puppy. We'll start with the shadow of the belly and the legs. The sun's quite high, so the bottom of the dog is in its own shadow, while the back and the top of the head is going to be in sunlight. And that same rule applies for the people. I'm going to leave their heads white and then just paint their bodies, whatever they're wearing, a shirt, a jacket, and the legs. I have changed brushes. This is a smaller brush, so work with the biggest brush that you can for each element and occasion that asks for a smaller brush than what I had before. but it's still not tiny. This forces you to be a little bit imprecise and invites accidents, and it invites a bit of randomness. And then the shadows, both of the people and the dog, and you can see the power of shadows. It really brings things into the world. Right, I'm really at the last few minutes of my painting. I'm just going to add a bit of texture here and there. Time for the tape to come off. That's when you can stand back and look at the painting and see if everything's right. And I decided that that furthest bit of the headland is a bit too dark. I felt it was stopping us from getting pulled out into the distance. So I'm taking a bit of clean water and a tissue to lift off some of the pigment, and now I'm happy. If you made it this far, thanks very much, and please like this video so it gets shared to more people.